Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Berna Lee, and we're going to be talking about Chinese astrology. Hey, Berna, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm super excited to do this episode today. I've wanted to do an episode on Chinese astrology for a long time, and I actually just did one on the I Ching with Benabel Wen a few months ago in September.
Wow.
And I recently saw that you were teaching a course on Chinese astrology through the Sophia Centre, and I thought you would be a great person to do this interview with. So, yeah, thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you. My course right now at the Sophia Centre, it's called Cosmic Connections: An Introduction to Chinese Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. So in the class, I actually just started last week. So we are talking a lot about the history, like when it started and the development, and about Mandate of Heaven, a little bit touch on that too, and also about occult practices and how what is it like in the contemporary times as well. Mhm.
Amazing. Yeah, it's incredible. Like the course outline looks super comprehensive. So since this is your first time on the show, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background and training and like where you come from in terms of astrology. Yeah, so how did you get started or what's your background in this topic?
So I am the 45th generation in my lineage. I'm from the Tang Dynasty royal Lee's family. It's called Wangjing, in Chinese Cantonese. Actually, I'm from Hong Kong. Like not like in ancient times. I was from Hong Kong. Like my mother city was in Hong Kong, but I was born and raised in Hong Kong. Um, and my family, for generations, they have been doing research on astrology because of our family background in the Tang royal family. We also have some classics, some of the books that are passed on from generations through generations. And our teacher from Tang Dynasty was a Tang royal astrologer, Yuan Kuan-chong, Yang Jun-song in Mandarin. And so there are a lot of teachings from him, a lot of research from accumulated that we also have passed on in our practices. And so for me, it's more like it ran in the family that people in our family not necessarily are astrologers, but like my grandfather, he was uh, he built like a community for astrologers at the time, at his times, and they do research on the classics that we have at home. And so he did a lot of research and wrote a lot of books until he came to Hong Kong in the 50s or 60s. Yeah, I think 50s or 60s, when there was a cultural revolution and the wars and all that broke out. And so for me, I grew up with my grandfather and my grandparents, and I was basically sitting next to him when he was doing some astrology work when he was older, because I was at home and he was at home, and I was playing around with his books and like the definition, like the tortoise short shells, and like he would do all kinds of things with like different definitions and chart reading with the clients. And so like that's how I grew up. And astrology, it's kind of like a language at home for us too. Like my father and my uncles, a lot of them are male, like men does astrology in our family. And I'm probably the first woman who is doing this. And I'm excited and I am so happy to be able to join you and to teach the class. And this is amazing.
That's incredible. I mean, that's in ancient times, it seemed like a lot of different cultures had lineages of astrologers that ran through families, but in more recent times, it's not as common in the West to be able to learn directly from a family member, let
Mm.
alone having like that many generations of astrologers going that far back. So that's a really actually like unique position to be in, I feel like, compared to other astrologers that I've known in other traditions. And you've actually now are in college and you're working on a degree. You've done a master's thesis
Yes.
on contemporary views on Chinese astrology, right?
Yes, yes. I was it was a study and examination um, towards the work practices and the worldviews of contemporary astrologers and contemporary Chinese astrologers. And I also interviewed them with how their views on fate and free will might have influence on their work or on their lives, like in their lives. And I had some semi-structured interview that is more in-depth, and I was talking to some of the professional astrologers who has 20 plus years experiences in the field, and it was an interesting time to really talk to them and get to know how is it how how they work with their own experience involved.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. And so you've gotten it sort of from both worlds in terms of both knowing the practical lineage of astrology and how it's practiced by contemporary practitioners, but also starting to study or studying it in an academic context as well, so that you have a pretty rich background in the history also, right?
Yes, for history, um, I think I was a fine art major and I did a lot of antique restoration for my background. So like I do have the interest and some of the uh, background information about Chinese history mostly because I've done a lot of work specifically on pottery in Tang Dynasty and Han Dynasty and Qin Dynasty. So that kind of helps me, and I have the interest in Chinese history, and with my grandfather always talking about it, it gives me a good foundation to look into history in the context of Chinese astrology. Yeah, in the class, I did summarize it in a way that it's about the context in the context of Chinese astrology when we're talking about history. Mm,
Awesome. Okay.
yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. I'd like to talk about the history of Chinese astrology and what are its origins, where did it come from, and like what are the different eras or periods in terms of just broadly speaking, how you might define it?
Yeah, so in the legendary times in the Fuxi era, when we were talking about Chinese astrology, it was started probably from that era, from Fuxi, when he was trying to observe the natural phenomena. And in the legend, they said he picked up like a stick and then drew one line across when he was looking at the skyline. And that one line kind of like divided into yin and yang. And then we have the four directions. And, you know, in those times, like in the Fuxi legendary times, it was more like what concerned them was the natural phenomena, like the thunder, the wind, the water, and fire. And so, in that sense, from that four directions, he also put identified the eight trigrams with eight natural phenomenon on each of the directions. And then gradually, after he was divided it, the directions into the eight different positions, we also generated the 64 hexagram for later use. And so it was through the legendary times. And if you're talking about archaeological evidence and when it started, it was probably started sometime in the Stone Age of 6th millennium BCE, around that time, that we do see a lot of um, carvings, like stone carvings, in in this place in China that I did talked about it last week in class, and that we can see like the sun and the moon and some of the stars, especially the 28 lunar mansion. It wasn't like all in it, but then you can see there are symbols like with the tiger and the the dragon on the left hand side and the tiger on the right, and then we have the phoenix in the red bird in front of us, and then the back it's the North Pole, represent the North Pole of Beidou, seeing the Dipper. So there were these kind of symbols early on from the sixth millennium BCE to the fourth millennium BCE, from cliffs drawings to tomes, the ancient tomes, that we can see all these symbolism of the heaven and earth, with the drawings. Uh, so yeah, I would say that it started at those times when people were really observing how nature was interacting with us human and earthly earthly realm.
Okay, that makes sense. And so that's super far back. So that's like 5,000 BCE through 3 or 4,000 BCE, and then
Mm,
eventually, in terms of getting to more recent time,
mm,
recent times, when does there start being like a textual evidence of like a textual tradition for astrology? I know
mm.
in like Mesopotamia, for example, we don't see that until maybe 2000 BCE forward because they were writing on clay tablets that survive. What At what point did there start being a textual tradition as far as surviving evidence in the Chinese tradition?
So with textual, with actual Chinese characters, the Xiangxing characters, the earliest characters in China, it was started in 1675 BCE in Shang Dynasty. So in Shang Dynasty, there were oracle bones, and from the oracle bones, we can detect the different characters, and these characters they actually developed from pictures, like a pictograph. So you can see sometimes it's, say, for example, the word of Ming, which is fate in English, Ming. In this particular character, you can see there is a triangular shape on top. And then underneath it, you see a person kneeling on the earth. So that also tells us about the figure of a person when they are thinking about fate or Ming. What is there, like in the ancient times in Shang Dynasty, 1675 BCE, their idea of what fate is about. It's like a heaven with a mouth, and then a person, the human being on the ground, kind of like kneeled underneath it. Um, that sort of relationship that was being portrayed at the time. So in Shang Dynasty, we can see there started to have a lot of characters coming up, and we see that in the dynasty before that, in Xia Dynasty, that was the first time that people started to use the Ganji system, the branch and stem system, to calculate. Like that is the basic foundations of Chinese astrology. It's like a common language in Chinese astrology and Chinese medicine and alchemy in all of those areas. That this is the common basic alphabets, so-called alphabets, and to know. And so from Xia Dynasty, it's called Xia calendar, and Xia calendar right now in the modern times, we call it the yellow calendar or the yellow emperor calendar because the emperor in Xia dynasty, it's the yellow emperor. That's why we're still addressing this calendar or the farmer's almanac as the Xia calendar or the yellow emperor calendar. So textually, coming back, textually, it's from Shang Dynasty with archaeological evidence of how they record the celestial phenomenon and the terrestrial happenings. It was from Shang. But if you're talking about when they started to use the Ganji system, the sexagenary cycles, it was back in Xia Dynasty. So that was probably 2698 BCE in Xia Dynasty. Um, yes. And since
Got it.
then, yeah, people use it for bureaucratic purposes. Started. at around the time. Mhm.
Okay. So yeah, so that I guess that becomes important is that the type of astrology that develops then by that point and going forward over the next 1,000 years until you get to the Han Dynasty was a type of what I guess historians call mundane astrology, right? Where it applies to large groups of people or to the nation or to the emperor.
Mm. That's a great question. I wouldn't say that it's just started from Han Dynasty. However, Han Dynasty was an important dynasty for Chinese astrology because it was the earliest time when Chinese astrology was being categorized into different categories, the use of them. Um, I was going to talk about this in the second class, which is tomorrow,
Okay.
that in Han Dynasty, this book compiled by the historian called Qi Le or Cat Le in Cantonese, my mother tongue. That's actually I feel more comfortable in speaking in Cat Le. So Cat Le meaning the seven strategies. And in Han Dynasty, the historian, the royal historian, collected all of the fragmented text from Qin Dynasty and started to recreate the categories, the Chinese astrology categories into the classics, the philosophy, and then there are some of prose and poems and Chinese astrology for fate and for definition. And then there's also feng shui called shapes and forms. Like there are seven categories in total. Um, but the basics one that I think it's more important, it's this category called calculations and methods, because that is the most basic things that everyone has to understand before they can jump into the applications of it. So Han Dynasty, it was important because it was the time when Chinese astrology started to be in different categories. Before that, I would say that there are a couple of different times that Chinese astrology developed in different ways. After Xia Shang, that we just talked about earlier with the Xiangxing characters, the earliest Chinese characters appeared in Shang Dynasty. In Zhou Dynasty, it was when I Ching came about. And in I Ching, for definition, people didn't really just make use of the um, they were trying to not just use the oracle bones, but using the 64 hexagram in combining with the oracle to do the divination, and also using some of the yellow, what do you call that?
Oh, yarrow stocks.
Yarrow stocks, yes. I'm trying to think about the English name of it, to do definition. So that was also a part of an important times in Chinese astrology. And then right after that, coming to the spring and autumn era and the Warring States period, it was very colorful because there was the hundred schools of thoughts. There were like philosophers like Lao Tzu, like Confucian, like legalism, like Mohism. Like there are a lot of philosophers came up and they started to debate about what kind of ways shall we strategize these wars, or what kind of who shall I be supporting for this mandate of heaven? Like how are we going to read the skies, like read the terrestrial phenomenon? Um, so there were a lot of debates, a lot of discussions, and a lot of smaller kingdoms trying to fight against each other with all these techniques that they see from the sky and also they read from the terrestrial.
And this is all in like the first millennium BCE, like 1000 BCE to like 300 BCE, right?
Spring and autumn era and warring state period would be 403 to 221 BCE, around that period of time.
Hmm.
And there were also texts excavated of the first sighting of the comet Halley. with illustrations and also with what they represent. And also there were some of the excavated piece like this lacquered cushion, or it looks like an ancient cushion, but it might be a suitcase too, like a small case, lacquered case with the drawings of the 28 lunar mansions and also the Beidou, the dipper, like the whole Chinese cosmos, like the sky illustrated on the lacquered piece. And um, it was an interesting time where scholars, astrologers arose, and in these times of constant wars and chaos, people tried to find a way to have some stability at the time. Mm.
That makes sense. Um, so that was a point that you talked about in your master's thesis, in your dissertation, where you pointed out that astrology is not in isolation in China, but it's like arising within the context of, on the one hand, you have the emergence of the I Ching, like you mentioned, as a form of divination, but also you have the different religions and philosophies that were developed during that time, as well as other medical and occult practices that were developed as well. And all of these are interconnected in different ways.
Yes. So the religions came after, probably became more popular and kind of mixed with astrology during Tang Dynasty. And from then on, there were also a lot of different schools that arose. For example, the Buddhist astrology, and there are a lot of astro magic that came about when there were a lot more diverse culture that was introduced in China at the time. But before that, it was more like a Chinese root astrological knowledge that we have accumulated from nature, from phenomenon. And um, yes, I'm sorry, I just forgot your question as I was
Oh,
thinking.
just to that that there was that I guess on one hand that Chinese astrology was partially arising in the context of other divinatory and occult practices, but also then during that period in the first millennium BCE that some of the classic religious and other philosophical texts that are
Mm,
commonly associated with
yes.
Chinese culture were also arising as well.
Yes. So that's a great question because it started because first of all, in what we just talked about in Warring State period, at the end of Warring State period, when this particular kingdom, Qin Dynasty, won all of the kingdoms, he was the first person to unite China into one piece, like one country, so-called at the time. And so Qin Shi Huang, it's the first emperor of China, and he decided that these all of these like five element progression for dynastic succession, like these theories of five elements, it's not what he wants because it actually affect his stability for power. So he wants to have uh, a morality by having this persecutions of scholars and astrologers and burning of a lot of books at the time to kind of stop these kind of knowledge to spread and pass on to generations after. And at the time, he was trying to reestablish this cosmic parallelism in the Chinese cosmology by putting himself in along with the Dipper around at the Purple Temple Palace in this section, like right on at the North Pole um, in the center. So it's almost like a movable, however you are revolving around him. Like it is almost like a movable. And that's how he tried to reestablish himself as the center of the pole, as the center of on Earth, and also as an equivalent of this supernal lord in the sky. Um, After that, in Han Dynasty, the Han Gaozu and a lot of other people and astrologer especially was also helping him to kind of to establish the mandate of heaven that he was the one who we support, and and that is why the five elements and all of these dynastic succession theories came about again, and to support himself in getting the throne and the mandate of heaven. And then when he established himself as the king, as the Han Dynasty emperor, the first emperor of Han Dynasty, he again in the history like there's other like Sima Qian was also like writing about the celestial phenomenon, what happened at the time with the the planetary parade, and that facilitate the whole thing to have this new era to emerge. And um, so it wasn't from Sima Qian, I should say that it wasn't him who wrote that. It was 300 years later, 3 centuries later after Han Gaozu. Um, this other uh, historian called Zhang Heng wrote about these celestial phenomenon. Zhang Heng was also a royal astrologer, and he was also a historian, one of the historian and inventor of Han Dynasty, and he was writing about dating back to Han Gaozu to write about the celestial phenomenon. So sometimes these things are very institutionalized in a way. If you're talking about the celestial officials and all of these, um, um, how you read the sky, how you read the stars, a lot of times it is so institutionalized that um, it's great to know the background information about it, but when we're reading it, it is also important to have a basic foundation of what they were like before these times of filtering, yeah, of
Makes sense.
imperialism. Mm.
So yeah, so that seems like a really important turning point that people need to know if they're not aware of the history, but just from, let's say, 220 BCE forward, that's the beginning of the Chinese imperial period, where the different like separate states get combined from that point forward into like singular dynasties and a
Yes.
succession of dynasties, but that astrology becomes part of the royal court and it's being
Mm.
used by the rulers, and especially interpreted in that context of who's in charge at the time.
Yes, yes. That's why the astrologers, the royal astrologer, has also a very important role all these times since probably since Shang Dynasty, actually, Xiashangzhou Dynasty. It was already very important, but at the time, um, it was used for dynastic succession, like how they calculate it with different foundations in Chinese astrology, like with the philosophy of it, uh, the foundation of it, but not necessarily um, having one unified, like Qin Shi Huang was having this idea of putting himself as the center of the sky. But after his era, it started to happen a lot more often for the emperor to uh, put himself in the equivalent with the pole. Mm.
Okay. So that became really like central then, that the emperor was supporting astrology and had court astrologers. And you mentioned this at one point, this idea of a mandate of heaven. Could you expand on like what that is or what that was about or what role that played in culture?
The mandate of heaven originally before Qin Dynasty, so from Xiashangzhou to Warring State period, the mandate of heaven was seen as some of the celestial phenomenon, say for example, the planetary parade and which direction is it and how is that particular part of the sky, it's in relation to the pole. That is how they identify whether this section of the sky that, let me see how I can put this better. I'm not explaining it in a way that is clear, I think.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Um, you don't have to get
Um,
into the technical. I was more just thinking of the concept in your dissertation. You wrote that the emperor's right to rule was granted by heaven. Is that true?
yes. Yes, yes, yes. So in that um the emperor's role was granted by heaven. That is basically what the mandate of heaven means. And in Chinese wordings, there is this four characters called Xiao Ming Yu Tin. That also is saying that the right to rule is from heaven. And how do we see that? It's to read into the sky and relate it back on earth and see which section of or which position is this king located right now and what is their relationship with the pole. It's like what is going on with them. And that's how people read the mandate in the times before Qin Dynasty. But after Qin Dynasty, we know that he placed himself, Qin Shi Huang placed himself in the pole, and it just it just becomes a constant thing. But yes, and also sometimes when say comet um, came about or novas came about, comets might mean something that is happening, and the morals of the emperor needs to be revise or review how he is doing, that could indicate um, some of those elements, some of those factors. And for Nova, sometimes it means a rise of someone more of importance. And so for some of the emperors, they might get a little like, I'm not sure like what this means, like someone important is has born or and that gives them some kind of hints. um there's this interesting thing that I was thinking about. It's that in the ancient times in China, it was probably like the internet. It's not internet. The sky was more like a sky net that people look up to see information of what's happening around them in the neighboring kingdoms, or like what is going on in around them to strategize um, or weaponize these information that they can get from the sky. So it's kind of like a Skynet, not like Terminator Skynet, but like literally like a Skynet. And instead of internet that we today we go online and see what's happening around the world. At the ancient Chinese times, we look at the sky to see and to get hints from what's going on around and how can I strategize better.
Right. So they were paying attention to omens like eclipses and comets and novas as telling them things about how the kingdom was doing and how the emperor themselves was doing, and including their conduct, but also in relation to the potential for like wars or conflicts with other kingdoms as well.
Yeah, yeah, they would. Some of the people, like from scholar, Professor Pankanier, he also he wrote a lot about the Shangzhou dynastic succession. And I think his work about this dynastic succession is that he illustrated and also translated some of the ancient texts at the time that was describing what's happening in the sky and how Zhou people, which is the rival of Shang Dynasty, um, also saw these signs in the sky. And Shang Dynasty astrologer also saw these signs in the sky. And a couple of years before Zhou finally won the war, and so it's almost like both of the parties knew there's something that's coming up, um, and Joe has more kind of like this confidence in this as well, knowing that this is my time to legitimize this war and I can do something about it and conquer Shang and becomes Zhou Dynasty after Shang. That's one of the way that people used at the time to weaponize it or to justify wars and revolutions when they see fit.
Right. One of the things that they used to justify or that they associated, as I think you mentioned earlier, there was a lineup of five different of all the visible planets in the sky at the beginning of the Han Dynasty, and this
Yeah.
was seen as a really important astrological omen that they associated with the rise of that new dynasty.
Yes, these planetary parade, they did relate it to like a new era, it's arising or something of a change, like a huge change is coming collectively in the Chinese world. Han Dynasty was one, and then there was this other times in Tang Dynasty when the first emperor, the second emperor actually of Tang Dynasty, come into position. There was this planetary parade thing that was also recorded, and that came a really colorful, vibrant time of in the Chinese world at the time. So people were saying that it is not exactly a bad omen, but it is a good change. So whether or not it is a bad thing or a good thing, it really depends on the position that you are standing of that big change that is coming. Mm,
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that brings up maybe something important is that for a very long time, Chinese astrologers were paying attention to like regular planetary movements and seasons and things like that, but they seem to be especially interested in things that were anomalous, that like stood out, that were not frequent, like especially like a comet that shows up out of nowhere, this that is an infrequent phenomenon, or like a supernova or even eclipses, and they seem to have really taken note of things like that as being important. Is that right?
In Chinese astrology, the patterns in the sky was seen to reflect all forms on Earth. And so when they look at the sky, that there is, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I was a little distracted earlier and I totally couldn't digest the question that you asked me.
That's okay.
Um,
I was just in some of the literature I was reviewing leading up to this, some of the
mm,
scholars were saying that the Chinese astrologers seem to be particularly interested in astronomical phenomenon that
ah,
showed up out of nowhere, that was anomalous, so that
yes,
like a comet, for example, appears
yes,
suddenly without any warning.
yes, yes. In I believe in Shangzhou Dynasty, there was already a lot of recordings about this phenomena, this celestial phenomena that you just talked about, and some of them are seen as good omen, and some of them are like bad omen, and and I think because like in I Ching, we see that all of the forms um, in the sky also reflects on Earth. It's called xiang and xing. Xiang meaning the patterns, and xing it's the forms and shape on Earth. And that's how we form the Chinese characters as well. So whenever there is something that is not normal or regular happening in the sky, it also indicates that something is not normal or not regular that is happening on Earth,
Hmm.
especially for the kingdom. And that's why these phenomenon like eclipses, solar eclipses or moon eclipses, and comets and novas, these are some of the things that in the ancient time they will record it. And sometimes they will put drawings on it, just like the one that excavated in Warring State period with the comet Halley, and they will record what was happening at the time and what is the possibility of whatever that is going to happen. For example, what is if the tail is longer, what does that mean? The tail is shorter, what does it mean? When it's brighter, dimmer, or sparkling, what does it mean? And so there are a lot of indicators to read about in the books on the observing of the patterns in the sky. And these are some of the phenomena that we are looking deeper into.
I'm
Mostly
really
for the mandate
fascinated.
of heaven, yes, but mostly for the mandate of heaven,
Hmm.
not a lot for them in reading natal astrology because natal astrology came about in Tang Dynasty. So by the time they were recording these phenomenon, it was way before natal astrology was established, and in those times in Xia, Shang, Zhou, Warring State period, Qin Dynasty, Han Dynasty, it was mostly about the kingdom, the wellness of the kingdom, the well-being of the people. That's more what it was about.
I'm really fascinated by that because a year ago I got really into studying comets, and I found that the Chinese astrologers did the best job of anywhere in the world of tracking comets. That they thought they were so important that for many centuries they took very regular observations and notes about comets that still survive to this day. Whereas in the West, there was a mistaken understanding about what comets were because Aristotle said that they might just be like vapors in the atmosphere. And I think as a
Ah,
result of that, that actually held back progress and study of comets in the West. But
mm,
in China, the records are very extensive, and also the delineations are very extensive. You mentioned that there's this the Book of Silk that survives from 300 BCE that has
mm,
illustrations of like 28 different comets and their interpretations, right? Or maybe it's
mm,
30 comets.
yes. I think these for ancient China, we do have in astrology two of the important things that we do. It's one of them is the astronomical observation, and then the second important thing it's about astrological calculations, and both of them has they come hand in hand, and not only reading the sky, but we also do a lot of calculation in astrological sense. Um, and those physical phenomenon that they recorded, I think it is great because in Chinese history, there is definitely less disruptions as Western astrology. So there are a lot of great texts that has passed on that is possible. Um, and for Chinese astrology as well, during the Ming Dynasty or Yuan Dynasty, when the Mongolians were in charge of China, that was when a lot of astronomical instruments that came into place, and then they started to use um, a lot of these instruments to observe even closer of the comets and of the planets and of everything. And so our star map in China also revised at the time, since the Silk the Book of the Silk, they already has revised it after in Ming Dynasty and then revised again, probably in Qing Dynasty to be more to update the whole thing. But when the scientists, I mean, like right now, it's not that I'm reading a paper or anything, but it's on top of my head that when they were looking into it, they found out that although at the time they were only recording with the physical, like what they could see, the color and like the shapes and all of those characteristics, but they were pretty close to what they actually are studying or looking through the astronomical instruments when they were introduced. Um, so yeah, I think that is really fascinating and so much to learn and look into, especially now we have much more advanced like scientific ways of looking at the physical thing. While in ancient China, we also use the astrological calculations in some of the ways, and also use this special resonance when we are feeling or kind of trying to sense the situation of what's going on. That is part of being an astrologer. It's to have that kind of resonance as well, as much as what we see and what we can calculate. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Mhm.
Is it true that comets were referred to sometimes as broom stars and they were associated with sweeping away the old, and
The
sometimes
old
that,
order or like the old era. It was being written that way, but I would say that to really look into the particular um, time when the comet was uh, that was being detected, what was really going on, and what dynasty was it, and what was happening? Would it be a propaganda? Would it be, it really depends on the context of when they are writing it and who was writing it. It's like how we read history. So it's hard to generalize, like, is that the broom sweeping out an old era or old order that is no longer good for us, or like there is a lot of reinterpretation in that, but generally yes, it was called the broom because it was said that whenever this happened, the old order will be swept away. And yeah. It's
okay.
interesting
And
stuff.
so as a result of that, sometimes the emperor would do things in order to try to mitigate negative omens potentially, or even I thought that it was interesting that sometimes there was like a moral component to it, that sometimes a comet or other ominous phenomenon would be interpreted as the emperor needing to change something that they're doing, or doing something that wasn't moral that needed to be improved.
That would sometimes that happen as well, like as a warning sign um, for how the ruler it's doing. Like we can also look at the sky, and um, for the ruler to how do I put it? For the ruler to make the situation better, sometimes we'll have different kinds of rituals to be done in a particular way at a particular time and date that we choose and pick, and that is how it works in the ancient times, and also for our contemporary times, to choose the auspicious time and date for different things, like for an opening of a business, or for moving into a new home. That's how that is different now, but like the use of it is different, but we are still using that kind of cosmic parallelism in in our day-to-day life for rituals and picking an auspicious date and time to work with things that are important to us.
Okay, so that actually brings up one of your particular areas of focus, which is the idea of fate and the role that fate played as a concept in Chinese astrology. Where do you start, or what's your entry point for understanding that?
Um, for fate and free will, when I was doing my research, I was in a class. I've read a lot of Western philosophy about fate and free will, and then it prompted to me that I want to know how, like, what are the thoughts about the Chinese contemporary astrologers? Like what are their thoughts, and how do they look at fate and free will? It's free will a thing? Is there an extent of free will? Um, and then so that was part of my research. And so in the Chinese concept of um, fate and free will, there is an extent of free will in it from I Ching, because change is inevitable. And in change, there is an element of chance in it. And in the element of chance, I can have this explanation that I feel like it can explain better. It's William James' two-stage model of free will. He mentioned that in free will, there is two stages. One is choice and the other is chance. And that is exactly how in I Ching, how how they describe these possibilities, these endless possibilities. It's in that quantum change of chance. Because choice, you can make a choice, but chance is something that you can't really get your hands on. But that doesn't mean that you human doesn't have the responsibility in that direction that you're going, because choice also determine that trajectory of whatever that you are choosing. And so in 命运, or in the Chinese notion of fate, 命 means fate, the innate quality of what you were born with, and 运 meaning that cycle of fate, the cycle of it. How are you going to jump into this natural order of cycle to make the highest potential, like the highest possible potential to be materialized or actualized? That is the point of the free will, that we have to choose and let the chance unfold for you. That's basically what 命运 means, or the Chinese notion of fate means. So, in this meaning of 命运, or the Chinese notion of fate, we can easily see that in the I Ching, from I Ching, Ming and Yun, it's the cycle of fate. And in this cycle, we do have an extent of free will in it. But after, maybe in Qin Dynasty, and after that imperialism kicked in, a lot of these had changed because philosophy arose, religion were introduced, and they have different intentions of these organized groups, big groups. They have different intentions. There were power struggles. They want stability. They want power control. So, an authoritarian kind of fatalism, kind of way arose at the time after Qin Dynasty. Like Qin Dynasty, he killed all of the scholars and astrologers, leaving nothing behind except himself as the center. And that way, that authoritarian thing also imposed that idea of fatalism, like this is the only way. And
Hmm.
he was trying to overthrow the determinism with the dynasty before him, that with the five element cycle, or the progression, or the destruction cycle, that there is something with cause and effect. And that way, it's also not as an extent of free will as we want to talk about in I Ching, which we still need to date back to Xia Shangzhou period, in that mentality. So you can see that in China, the mentality of fate and free will also changed through time because of political reason and the political rhetoric of how they use astrology as a tool instead of looking at the natural phenomenon, with an extent of free will. And so, yeah, that's how I look at it.
Sure. Okay. So maybe on the one
Yeah.
hand, there are ideas of determinism and of fate, and the notion that when an astrological omen appears, it means something specific is going to happen one way or another. But then on the other hand, there's also conceptualizations of choice, and even perhaps uses of types of electional astrology, of maybe choosing when to act in the hope that you'll have a better outcome on a
Yes.
good date versus like a bad one.
Yes, yes, yes. I think that's part of how we can initiate that change in getting into that natural order of harmonization between people and the environment and the heaven. Um, the rituals did was one of the ways, and then human initiation and actually doing something with their own actions is one of the ways. Um, and yeah, and that's why I think rituals, it's a big part in Chinese culture, even till today.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm.
So going back to some of the earlier omens that we talked about, just in the context of mundane astrology and the emperor during the imperial period, sometimes when things like an eclipse would happen, eclipses were sometimes viewed as negative omens and could indicate like the death of an emperor, or a war or a famine. But sometimes the emperor might issue an edict in order to promise change or improvement. Or I read in one instance they might release prisoners as a sort of way to ward off some of the negative omen indicated.
Yes, I believe that there are a lot of historical texts that was written um, that they also described what happened in the sky and what they do in response to what they're reading from heavens. Um, but as I mentioned earlier, I think we do need to read it in the particular context of the dynasty. It's hard to generalize it as like this must mean something. But of course, there are classics that written that this means this and that means um, uh, this will happen if there is an eclipse. But yeah, I believe so. But like nowadays, when I'm looking at it, I I would be more careful that there will be something maybe borderline negative might happen, or like I need to be careful. But then does it mean that the emperor is going to die, or like it's possible, but then there are still things that we can do to kind of um, make the situation better. And that's how we make use of the extent of free will instead of thinking that it is determined. And when this happens, this cause and effect, or this is the phenomenon that we are seeing, and he's gonna die. And uh, I don't think that's the way to go. But yeah, there's this interesting story that I want to share with you in terms of why I took the course and why I will feel this way that I want to dig into fate and free will. Um, my grandfather was an astrologer, a Chinese astrologer, and he was also a researcher, and he supported his community in doing a lot of research. So he really, really believed, of course, in his own predictions or his own readings in his own chart. And so I think when he was pretty old, like 80 something, 90 years, 90 something years old. He read in his own chart that in 2 years there will be something that will be happening, that there's a possibility that he is not going to make it. And so when it was him, he was reading it and he was very confident, of course, about his skills and his readings, and he got really depressed. After all, we are mortal. And when he was at the time, he just got um, very depressed and he didn't really want to see anyone. He was staying at home all the time, doing his own thing, doing reading, doing calligraphy and all. Um, and so at the time, when my dad picked up, my dad is the eldest son, and so in our lineage, usually the eldest son will learn the techniques, and he had his own worldviews and his own lived experiences, obviously. So he decided that besides astrology of reading, this a little bit determined kind of way of my grandfather's way, not Chinese astrology, but my grandfather as a practitioner, he was very confident about his own techniques. And my dad was very into religion. He started to study a lot of Buddhism philosophy and see if like he was pondering on the how to um, come out of this cycle of limitations that people are putting on themselves, and can we change our fate? Is it written in stones? Is there anything that we can do more than the rituals that we can already try? Um, so that's my dad. He was looking into philosophy and religion, and then for me now, when I am looking back at my grandfather's experience and my dad's experience, for my research, I am trying to look deeper into going back to the natural phenomenon of how we were using I Ching and what did the I Ching said about fate and free will, and how can we use that as a tool that can empower people to have free will, and how are we going to get that most highest potential that we can get in this natural order. So that is something that I want to share with you in terms of sometimes when we read certain phenomenon, it's interesting to look at the history, but at the same time, I think we also need to remember that we have free will and extent of it, and we can always try to do things to um, ride on that wave. Just like in I Ching, they said it's learning how to ride on the dragon, basically. And that's what we learn in astrology to I think, to empower people and not think that it's determined. Mm.
Sure, for sure. Yeah. That's definitely a tension I think that all astrologers experience, especially in terms of inheriting some of the older traditions and the heaviness that can sometimes come with some of those predictions and some of those omens, especially when something
Mm.
negative is indicated versus our feelings as like people living in the 21st century, as contemporary modern people that want to be empowered and not give in to fatalism as a result of what you see about the future.
Mm.
That seems like a very universal struggle that contemporary astrologers have.
Right.
What was the outcome of that story though with your grandfather and what he saw?
Um, so 2 years later, after he read that, he did pass the year that he saw that he was going to pass. Um, and so now that I look at it, when I'm reading the charts, when I see there is certain possibility of some of the things that could happen, I would encourage the client to do something beforehand. Say, for example, it's about health, just an example. Then you can start to go for a body checkup uh, more often, or particular body parts, or, start exercising ahead instead of doing what you're already doing every day and not making any changes. Um, I think like in our day and age, it's not only rituals that we can do, but also there is something that we can actively do um, for self-development that maybe we can exceed um, that thing that we're reading from the chart. Like if anything, you want to grow out of the chart, it has to be from you. It cannot be from other people. I mean, rituals can help, I think, in some of the cultures, like different cultures have different rituals that would be helpful, but also taking the initiative to work on the things that we are in control. It's also it will help as much as yeah. Mm.
That makes sense. Yeah, and maybe there's a parallel there already with other practices like feng shui and how you try to
Mhm.
change things in your environment in order to have a more optimal outcome than you might have otherwise.
Yes, feng shui, it's one of the things that we do in the family for the particular for our practice. So it's like when your environment become more harmonized or more flow, then you will have a clearer mind in doing the things that you want to do for health and for abundance and all. So feng shui, it's also using the form of our environment to influence the form, like as a human being in that environment. So it's also they are all connected, like how we read the sky reflected on the earth, and then how the earth will affect the people living in it. Um, so yeah, that's one of the things. So I want to add just that my when my grandfather passed, why he was also doing the rituals, but some of the things that couldn't help. I was just always thinking about like it's not only the environment, but we ourselves need to do something about like if you're very depressed and you're not going to the therapy or not doing anything about it, and then just close the door and be with yourself, then nothing is gonna change. Not then, yeah. So I think as much as the environment, the people and what you're doing, it's also part of the forms of our world that can make changes. And yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that, part of my book, I wrote a book about ancient Western astrology, and that did bring a more deterministic form of astrology into modern times. And I think something contemporary astrologers who've started going back and reading ancient
Mm,
texts have struggled with is sometimes getting used to more deterministic forms of astrology where
mm,
what happens if there is an instance where there is something that's not negotiable in terms of your fate, no matter how hard you try. Because I think we all have sometimes those instances where no matter how hard you try to get away from something, there's just something that's outside of your control. And,
mm.
are we able to control everything necessarily about our fate? Do you,
I
I
don't,
mean,
I mean, I don't think we can control everything. Um, but how we read the chart with the 60 Ganji cycles, sometimes some of the ways that we read and to interpret it, um, you have to sense what it means. It is not very literal. So I do think that there are some of the ways that we can, as an astrologer, I think it's um, that I walk together with the client to see this is what I think, this is the possibilities, and let's apply it to your situation particularly. What can we do, and what is the best way that we can find in this situation with what I'm reading? Um, and I think there are a lot of possibilities, but we have to feel it in and not read it so literally. Sometimes when we are reading it so literally, it limits our imagination and the possibilities that we can go and how far we can go. Um, yeah.
right. Yeah. And you also bring up a really good point that there's an element of interpretation to astrology, and there's ambiguity there inherently due to the element of interpreting symbolism.
Hmm. Yes, I think so. That is why I was saying that when we started the conversation, you mentioned about Han Dynasty was an important times in Chinese astrology's development, and I totally agree because at that time it was because of their particular worldviews, the dynastic worldview, that they will categorize it as warfare strategy, as prose and poems of the great minds. And who are the great minds? Like, who is the editor? Who was writing this? Who was approving these categorization? Like, they have a sort of like a worldview in identifying them and putting them into these ways that is best for their times, serving the kingdom. But in our times, it's also very different. And so, like, what is important to us might not necessarily be important to them at their time. And so, like, for us, it might be more about we might put in our times in late 70s to 80s, the categorization of Chinese astrology has changed. It became five different categories. Mainly, the first one, it's about the body and mind. So it's about how we can have a healthier practice with Chinese astrology, but internally and as well as physically. How do we move in the world physically, and how do we practice strengthen our mind? And then the second one, 医卜星相山. So, and then the second one is medicine. So, Chinese medicine is one of the ways that is more important to us and relevant to us, not important, but relevant to our times. And then there's about fate, the natal astrology, and then feng shui. That's the last one that was mentioned in the categorization. And these categorization also reflected how people late 70s to early 80s felt about this technique that has passed down. How are we going to make use of it in the best way that we could? Um, and so I think the worldviews has a lot to do with how we use and how we think.
Yeah, that makes
Mm,
sense. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that the Han Dynasty from 200 BCE forward, that you felt like the astrology became more deterministic as well as systematized during that time, because in the West, a parallel thing was happening with the emergence of Hellenistic astrology and horoscopic astrology, which was also very deterministic at the time and tied in with Stoicism. So I always thought it was interesting
mm,
that there was a parallel development that were probably completely independent in two different parts of the world that were
yeah.
emerging at the same time.
Hmm. That's interesting to know. Um, yeah, in Han Dynasty. It will be interesting to know what's happening around the time, like because we know that in Planetary Parade that the Han Dynasty, Han Gaozu, arise to be the first emperor, the first Han emperor, and
Mhm.
I wonder what happened at that time in the Western world at like a similar time of, let me see the year of it, 206 BCE.
So that was during the period in which it was the period after Alexander the Great had taken over a lot of the Mediterranean and Middle East, and then
Ah,
subsequent to that, a bunch of his successors fought for the next century or so. And during that time, the Roman Empire started to arise as the dominant superpower in the Mediterranean. So
oh,
Rome started to emerge at that time, essentially.
wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
amazing to know.
interesting, interesting parallel there. There's probably something going on with the astrology. Maybe it was that planetary parade, that lineup of planets.
Hmm.
Um, but anyways, I wanted to get through a few more discussion topics before
Mm.
we run out of time. One of them is one of the only things that many people outside of in the West know about Chinese astrology is the notion of the 12 animal signs. And I was
Mm.
wondering if you could speak to the origin of that and what role that plays in Chinese astrology.
So I think the zodiac animals probably arose in Tang Dynasty when a lot of the stars were deified because of the introduction of diverse culture at the time. There so-called the Western philosophy and religion, like Buddhism, came into China and flourished, and so their arts also came about, and that we can see in Dunhuang, the cave art, that there were a lot of deities, and that was drawn on the walls of inside of the caves, and we can see a lot of the stars or the constellations or the 28 lunar mansions were deified into human person, or into some really interesting figures. Um, so at that particular time, also the 12 animal zodiac has um, became animal head with like a human body kind of photos, or the paintings arose. So it was from Tang Dynasty, and that was
And
also
that's like 700 CE, let's say.
that
Ta-
is
Tang Dynasty, I have it written down as 618
six.
through 907.
Yes,
Okay.
618 CE,
So that's
and
pretty late development then in terms of like the history of Chinese astrology.
yeah. It was later in the dynasty that it developed, and but that was also the time when natal astrology developed by Li Xuzhong. Li Xuzhong was born in 761 CE, and he was the one who was trying to make this system that we are still using right now in doing natal astrology. So at the time, we have like Iranian, Islamic, Sogdian influences too in from Central Asia, through the trade routes, the Silk Road, and so like there were a lot of it. The culture was very diverse, and on top of that, with religion and all that was developing, and that leads to a lot of new schools that popped up, and also the zodiac sign of zodiac animal. Um, but for zodiac animal, we can also it's not like it came out of nowhere. It has the equivalents in the chart that we talked about in the 60-year cycle called 甲子, or the 60 Ganji system, that generates with the 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches. And the 10 heavenly stems and the 12 earthly branches interacts with each other. That generates the 60 terms. And the 60 terms has forms a complete chart called 甲子, 60 甲子. So every 甲子we will multiply into three as one complete cycle, and one major cycle would be 180 years. And with that, we also divide them into different elements. So with the different elements, we also come up with the different years. Say, for example, this year it's the year of the snake, 月季灵. So 季 in the 12 earthly branches, meaning snake. It could mean snake, and it could also mean yin fire. Like it has a lot of equivalents in that one particular word, and it can have different meanings when it combines with the heavenly stem of, say, for example, this year is yut. So yut, it's yin wood. So yin wood and yin fire. What does it mean? What does it tells us? And so we can so-called interpret or think about its meaning, that it has that entails for this year, particular year, as the with this earth branch combination. So for the zodiac animal, it is the 12 earthly branches that we talked about, and with each of them, sometimes I think in Western culture, how people usually read it is from the year that they were born, to identify themselves as which zodiac animal that they belong to. But in Chinese astrology, a lot of times we don't really use the year. We might use the day's branch, the day's stem branch as the as your personal reading, like the core of to read about you. That we'll use the day uh stem branch. I'm trying
Okay.
to translate it.
That's
Yes,
all right.
in my head. Yeah.
So that's
Big,
interesting. You made a point that it's integrated into the other concepts of like yin and yang are integrated, as well as
yes.
the in Chinese culture and astrology, there's five elements instead of in the West, there's four elements, and the Chinese elements are wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And that's
Mhm.
part of the background that goes into the 12 animal signs as well.
Yes, because in the 12 earthly branches, each of them has an element of yin, yang, yin, yang, and also with the five elements. And all of them together generates the 12 zodiac animals in a chart. So each of them has yin yang. Each of them has their five elements in it in itself. And when we are reading about a person, it's not only that earthly branch or that zodiac animal that we're reading. We also need to read about the heavenly stem that it is pairing with the branch. And that is only the day. And what we are trying to read in a natal chart, it includes all of the stem branch of the four pillars. That involves the year, the month, the day, and the hour. All of the four stem branch that we can see their association with each other and their relationship with each other to generate BaZi chart. BaZi means 8 characters. And in this chart, with the 4 pillars, each of them carry 2 Chinese characters. On top of it, it's the heavenly stem, and then the bottom part, it's the earthly branches that gives us 8 characters. And that's why the way we call the astrological chart in Chinese astrology, it's 八字 or 8 characters.
Got it. Okay.
Mhm.
And the years begins does it begins with the Chinese New Year, right? And what is the Chinese New Year based on?
The Chinese New Year, what do you mean Chinese New Year based on?
Is it connected like with like the new moon after like a solstice or something like that, or like a? I'm trying to think of um,
Yeah.
if it's based on an astronomical starting point for the new year, or how it's measured.
Yes, yes, it is based on the Chinese almanac, and um, the Chinese almanac. It's actually a lunisolar calendar. So we look at both the solar terms. There are 24 solar terms that we identified mainly in ancient times for agricultural purposes. And so every 15 to 16 days, there will be one term, and there are a total of 24 terms each year. And Lunar New Year, it's one of the terms in in this 24 terms, but we also combine it with the lunar cycle. So when there's a new moon, then it call it the first day, and then the 15th day, it's the full moon. So like we kind of try to do the cycles with also starting with the lunar cycle, but also adding on top of it with the solar term to complete the almanac, the farmer's almanac that we read today.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And going back to the 12 animal signs in the West, it's
Mm,
based on usually it's associated with like months, but in the Chinese system, the 12 signs are based on years.
year.
And sometimes people like speculate that's based on Jupiter, or was originally based on Jupiter, which also takes about a year to go through. It takes 12 years, or Jupiter is also like a 12-year planetary period. Was that
Mhm.
originally based on Jupiter, or is that not the correct connection to make?
It was based on the Jupiter in the very beginning. And so and you're right. And the sky was also read in the 12 different sections of wherever the Jupiter lands. And that would be the the section of Tai So, meaning the deity of the year. And usually in rituals, we would go to the temple every year during Chinese New Year to to do these to develop this ritual to tell the deity of the year that um, wish for good luck, sort of good luck. And um, according to the interactions of the stem branch, we can identify which animal signs are more, or like which of the sections or the animal signs that we call it today um, are are more lucky and which ones are less auspicious that we have to do more rituals about it. And that's what we do in Chinese New Year. But that's exactly what was said about it's reading about the Jupiter, the position of the Jupiter.
Okay. And
Mm.
so to what extent is it still the 12-year cycle and the 12 animals? To what extent is that still based on Jupiter versus to what extent is it separate from that now and is more almost like numerological in nature?
Right now, it is right now, like in Chinese culture, people no longer really look at it like they don't really look the astronomical side. It's more like a tradition that we do it with the astrological calculation more than observation, like real life observation of where Jupiter is right now or which section it is. We just use the like mostly using the calculation that we have been using for many, many years.
Got it.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's a little different. I'm trying to look for that info that I have here about Jupiter. Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
What are the 12 animal signs that are associated? I guess I forgot to mention like what the actual animals are.
Oh, we have the rat, the ox, and then tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, the goat, monkey, rooster, the dog, the pig.
Got it.
So
Okay.
that those are the um, 12 zodiac animals that have been identified in Chinese astrology. And each of them also have an equivalent of the 12 earthly branches of that character, of the earthly branches that can be associated with.
To what extent is I don't know, the characteristics or qualities associated with each animal, to what extent does that inform the astrological interpretation?
Some of the sometimes people look at it as like with their characteristics, but I personally wouldn't necessarily only reading like like a dog, they're very loyal and like it's not exactly like um how we interpret it today as some of the things that I read. But it's interesting, like how people associate different animals' characteristics. Like snake, for example, this year, it's about changes, which also I think it makes sense. Like some of them does make sense, but not necessarily all of them. Like it has to be read in multiple layers, like with the five elements of the animal and also with the yin yang of the animal sign and where they are in the particular year. So like say for example, if you're a year of the dog and then you are in this year of snake, how is your stem branch interacting with this year's stem branch? And that's how we read about what is going on with your sign instead of just looking at, oh, the year of the dog this year, it's like this and that. It's more generalized. I mean, it's not that it's not right. It's a way to do it, but it's not as precise as you're going for a real, like a more complete reading. So yeah.
That makes sense. So it's just one factor that you're layering
Mm.
on top of multiple different factors, including the quality of the element and the yin yang component as well. That makes sense.
Yes, yes,
That's
yes. There are more
very
layers to it.
that's very similar in Western astrology, where you might have like Taurus is like the bull, but then also it's said to be like an earth sign, and it's also
Mm.
a feminine sign. So those are the three things also
Mm.
taken into account there. So it's very parallel.
Yes, I think it's very similar the way you describe it. That makes sense.
Yeah. Um, all right. So I'm trying to think of other major practices. So you talked about natal astrology came into China after 600 or 700 BCE, and
Yeah.
I've done a previous episode with Jeffrey Kotick about the transmission of natal astrology through Persia and the
Mm,
interactions between the East and West through the Silk Road, and
mm,
through the Persian intermediaries, and how that sort of went back and forth. um,
mm.
to what extent did natal astrology become like a major approach to astrology that was distinct from the earlier mundane astrology from that point forward?
I would say that it's close by. After Han Dynasty, there were a lot of philosophy about fate that arose. And that was a time that people also think about what is fate. But for them to really do it in astrology as an individual fate kind of reading, it was Tang Dynasty. And I believe that was mostly because there was introduction of religion, of Buddhism, of all these kind of new ways of concepts that people start to think about them. They're like, how am I relating to the world and not just thinking about the mandate of heaven as everything in readings, just the well-being of the kingdom, you know. And that was a time when art was thriving and then philosophy was thriving, diverse culture, very inclusive, and intellectuals arose and they just start thinking about all these um, more on individual fate. Um, and I think that was probably why, because there was religion and philosophy flourishing at Tang Dynasty, and there was also more freedom in doing their own research as well. Because before then, in Han Dynasty and in those times, astrology was always a bureaucratic activity. And after Qin Dynasty, no one was able to really research into it. And Han Dynasty, they were all in the court. Um, so in Tang Dynasty, there was some of more of the freedom for people to research into it and make way in getting to know themselves in this astrological way.
Got it. That makes sense.
Mm.
So was astrology then, did it continue to be both state supported as well as something that was done by individual people in the public all the way up until the early 1900s?
And originally, it has always been state supported, including Xia Shangzhou dynasty and then warring state. Each little kingdoms, they have their own court, they have their own state, and it's also in the state supported thing to do. Tang Dynasty also, but in Tang Dynasty, there was more freedom for individuals to look into it, research into it. And in Song Dynasty, however, because of new Confucianism arose, and then they preferred something that can be more rationalized. Um, um, or it was a period when routinization with all with astrology, and they increase their attention in moral self cultivation and social ethical philosophy, and rejected all the systems were deemed spiritual or mystical. And so they see metaphysics or astrology as a guide for developing rationalist ethical philosophy rather than a catalyst or for spiritual development. So by that time, astrology was sidelined from the court, and it wasn't being one of the focus of the court anymore. And so individual research also, because of that, uh, people can have a chance to really have the space to develop it further. So I would say after Tang Dynasty's openness in Song Dynasty, because lack of focus on astrology, people can start to develop more about individual fate and astrology at that time on
Okay,
forward. Mm.
that makes sense. So in the Song Dynasty ended 1279 CE. And then one of the things you wrote about in your master's thesis that I didn't know about was that in the early 20th century, that after a lot of the revolutions and the cultural changes, that astrology fell out of favor and that a lot of the astrology in China moved away from mainland China to the periphery areas like in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Is
Mm.
that true, or to what extent can you talk about that transition?
Yeah. So Qing Dynasty ended around 1911, which was the last imperial dynasty in China. And then after that time, in around 1919, there was this very famous movement called the May 4th movement. And it was a time triggered by the Treaty of Versailles that China felt betrayed as Shandong was ceded to Japan instead of regaining sovereignty themselves. And so the students in Beijing went out for protest, large scale protest demanding national unity and reform. And they started a movement that they need to foster new ideas of democracy and socialism, and challenging a lot of traditional ideas and concepts and so they were challenging a lot of ancient traditions at the time. So that time that movement kind of set the stage for future political movements, including the rise of the PRC later on. So when in the 40s, when the PRC established, they abolished all of the traditional traditions, including Chinese astrology was one of them. And then during the Cultural Revolution, also the so in the 60s and 70s, the Cultural Revolution in China also result in a mass loss of cultural knowledge, including a lot of physical temples or texts were lost in during that time. It is a little sensitive, I admit this the
Sure,
topic.
yeah,
Um,
understand.
Yes, and so because of this movement, it also prompted a deeper reflection in China to preserve traditions and all of these classics. And so it was very unfortunate that there were a lot of texts and things that were gone, and a lot of people fled the country for that. But because of that, there were reflections done in China, and now we can see that there are also selectively some of the traditions that they decide to preserve, and how they categorizing it is again it's different because of the different worldviews and our cultural and historical background and development. So I would say that the preservation is fragmented because of that. And so um, in Hong Kong, however, or in other places like Taiwan or international communities, it preserved in a different way. Like I can't say that they in China they're not doing they are doing their own thing too. Like they're trying to preserve it the best way that they could, but there were not maybe there were a lot of loss in the years and history. And so in other places like in the periphery, like Hong Kong, um, under colonization, Chinese astrology and the culture actually provided uh, a really important gel. I don't know what word I can use for that to hold the community together as we are practicing it rigorously under colonization. And that is partly why here in Hong Kong or in international communities, we try to preserve that identity or that culture and to practice it from generations passed on generations. Um, and I think that is part of the difference between how we're preserving it. And so for me, I would think that even in the institutions, in universities in Hong Kong or in China or in other places, like they are not exactly putting Chinese astrology as a subject to really talk about it, because some of them still think that is superstitious due to the establishment of New China and also the May 4th movement. It was since 1919, year 1919, and with colonization, some of the people also feel like this is something that is so outdated. It's not not like not scientific or not logical, because they are not really reading into the philosophical roots and how it came about. Um, so yes, that's what think, that in China they did abolish a lot of traditions, but they still are trying to preserve some of the ones that they are trying to preserve in a way that they feel it's important to do. Mm.
Have things gotten better in the past few decades in terms of the practice of astrology in mainland China? Do you think it's some of the restrictions have lessened in recent decades? And do you know what the legality is at this point?
Definitely, I think the level of respect or has increased with more understanding of what Chinese astrology is and the traditions. So in China, you can still see that people are still very feel that the festivals like Mid-Autumn Festival, the Lunar New Year, or the Chinese New Year festival, they are important seasonal festivals. The 24 solar terms are still celebrated, and the culture is still being preserved as an agriculture tradition. So they do allow, or they still preserve some of the practice to be done. And while there are also some of the crackdowns of people using astrology to commercialize it, because in China, sometimes when the techniques and the history and the roots of it, it's not being studied or understood, there is a very high chance of misusing them, or taking advantage of people's curiosity, or just because they are yearning for something that is from the tradition and make use of, like, they misused it. And so there were a couple of times there were some bigger crackdowns in using Chinese astrology. But nowadays, I feel like as long as they are doing it in the more like a cultural way, or it's still a gray area, I would say, that I'm not exactly sure how this line plays sometimes. But I believe that they also do have respect for the ancient traditions in a cultural way and historical way, and it's a matter of worldview, like what they want to preserve and how to categorize them. It's the same dynasty through dynasty. So it's a really interesting thing to read into history sometimes, and to, as I said, when we're looking at the omens and all, we have to look at the background information. What context are we looking at? Who is writing it? And how are we reading it uh, as an individual?
That makes sense. I had done a previous interview with David Rayleigh at one point a few years ago where he talked about teaching a school of like Western astrology in China. And he said that it was more permissible as long as you're focusing more on it as in the psychological context or with like character analysis instead of
Hmm.
something more deterministic or predictive.
Yeah, yeah, like more approach like a form of culture, um, then I think it is fine, because there are too many people who doesn't really know much about the whole history and the philosophy of it, and then they misused it, and that also caused a lot of problems. Especially now we have AIs, and a lot of them I heard right now around in the Chinese communities, people will use AI to read their own charts, but they didn't really think about like the interpretation of it and the worldview of that. The astrologer also have the influence in how they read and how they present the whole thing. And so there's a lot of things that still need to wait. We need to wait and see how it's going to develop.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in your dissertation, you interviewed five different astrologers in order to talk about how they practiced and approached astrology in contemporary times as a living contemporary practice. So that's something you're really interested in documenting. What were some of the differences in terms of how different practitioners approach the technical practice of astrology today?
And I think all in all, the foundation of it is very similar. It's like when we're talking about Shang Dynasty or like using the Ganji system. All of the dynasty till now, we are still using the same Ganji system in doing the charts. So what is different? It's the worldview of the people and the approach and how they look at fate that kind of makes the things that is different, or the categorization of the applications of astrology. It's different. So from my research, I talked to the five different contemporary astrologers, and I found out that one of them actually still have this determined, very determined way of looking at fate. The reason behind it, it's also because this astrologer, this professional astrologer, has a very mixed background. She is actually from Malaysia, of Chinese ethnicity, a lady who was from Malaysia, and she practiced it along with a lot of other practices, including magic, including Western magic and Malaysian magic, and a lot of other practices involved in making her own practice. But she told me that in her core, she is still using Chinese astrology, BaZi, the BaZi Chinese astrological chart as the core in reading and in doing all the rituals and astro magic that she does. She used Chinese astrology as the core, but the way she is looking at fate is a little different than the other traditions, like not other traditions, but other astrologers that I have interviewed. So I think the diverse culture and beliefs has its influence in how they interpret charts.
Right. It seemed like they were, each of them represented a unique blend or fusion of some of the traditional or like ancient conceptualizations of Chinese astrology with some sometimes contemporary notions, including I saw one mentioned like quantum mechanics at one point, for example,
Yes.
was part of their like conceptualization of astrology.
Yeah, they do have different kind of conceptualization. Some feels that it's like mathematics. Some will use a prefer a scientific foundation with a approach to Chinese astrology, and some with a more artistic approach towards astrology as well. Uh, so they have different backgrounds, like how they grow up, and under this colonial system, has some influence in how they work and how they see life and how they experience the charts and how they read it. It's very interesting to see to know, and that's why in my paper, one of the important things is to decolonize these ways and to really put the original philosophical root, to come back to the roots and to decolonize all these ways or these filters or these imperialism or colonization that has been the filters of people. Can we go back to that and then start research in different points and see how did we come here? Yeah.
Right. Can you
Mm.
expand on that in terms of what role do you think colonialism played in terms of influencing Chinese astrology over the past few centuries, or getting rid of some of those older traditions and conceptualizations?
I think colonization did make it s- uh, um, did helped in a way. I should say it helped in a way that people with Chinese astrology or Chinese culture get together more tightly as a community because they want to preserve their identity, their cultural identity. That is good thing. But the bad thing is that because of colonization, a lot of, say, for example, in Hong Kong, a lot of names of the road has changed, and it was no longer the way we identify directions or the road, the harbor has changed. The fragrant harbor became Victoria Harbor, and there are a lot of things that has changed. So people kind of the younger generations, people kind of feel like this is not something that it's uh, that is not something that I can grow with. It's something that is outdated, and I can't live in a society and thrive in a society by staying Chinese as my family are. And so that kind of affect how people practice as well, like the way they see the world. Um, and also with colonization, um, people don't really practice it as much in in public. Like before, it was a court thing. Like everyone is practicing it, especially in court, and it's very important. But now it becomes something that is superstition, because of lack of interest and lack of focus in getting to know our own traditions. Um, and so it has over 100 years of influence of the mentality for that, and so it does it does impact how people look at it and how people use it and how they feel about it, whether they have that kind of pride or they want to know it or they feel like it's irrelevant.
That makes sense. Yeah. So that's part of your work is wanting to decolonize that and recognizing the traditional lineage of astrology in China as like an important part of Chinese culture.
Yes, yes, yes. Because in China, also this Chinese astrology part, it's not, especially in the recent history, the development of it, it's not included in history because of what we talked about earlier. And I hope that my research can give the voice for the contemporary astrologer in the context of Chinese astrology, that Chinese astrology now evolve and develop into not a bureaucratic activity. It is something that can help people to empower them to be to preserve our culture as much as we want to navigate through our lives.
Incredible. That makes sense. Beautiful. Well, since we're coming towards the end of our time, what are you working on now, or what projects do you have coming up in the future? What are your plans in terms of your career as a scholar as well as an astrologer?
I am I am trying to look into a PhD program, and hopefully I can do much more research in this area. And I hope that I can publish some of my works as well and keep on teaching classes and providing a way of reading for people, including natal astrology or feng shui in a way that it's relevant to our times. Um, that, yes, to make it more relevant to our people, to people.
That makes sense. All right.
Mm,
And you're teaching the course with the Sophia Centre right now.
yes.
We That's ongoing. Do you think you said you're not sure yet if that like recordings from that will be available
Mm.
um, at some point in the future?
I'm not sure if it will be available for late joiners to still join, but there is a possibility that it's possible. But otherwise, I think I would keep trying to do new courses and to introduce you to much more of the different stories and the different histories and research that I find interesting and to share with you and to really have more layers in getting to know Chinese astrology, and not only zodiac animals, but there is so much more to it as a culture and history.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, I
Mm,
look forward to hearing more about that and seeing more of your work. So
thank
you
you.
have a page on Instagram where people can follow you, and that's the best way to sort of track your work, right?
Yes, yes. It's on Instagram. It's called Astroemergency. So the way I made the name was that it's like astrology and emergency or emerging.
I like
So
that.
it's Astroemergency, and it would be great if you can put it in the link or like little word URL thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that
Mm-hmm.
and to any
Yes.
other websites or like contact information in the description below this video on YouTube, as well as on the podcast website. That way people can find your work and get in touch to yeah, just see what you produce in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining me today. We covered like so much in this episode, and obviously there's a lot we could have gone into with more depth, but I'm happy that we were able to talk about so much. So thanks for helping me to introduce my audience to such a big topic.
Oh, thank you, Chris, for this opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I love sharing about Chinese astrology. And yeah, thank you so much for this. It's fun.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly Electional Astrology podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alibarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, and Berlin West. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software AstroGold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Finally, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening May 22nd through the 26th, 2025. Their in-person conference is sold out, but you can still register to get a virtual ticket where they're going to stream the conference simultaneously online in May, and you can register for that now through their website at norwac.net.